All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Martha, for the introduction. And thank you so much, Jenna Lee and Claire, for that really moving session. As Martha said, colleagues of yours have come on the course I organize. And for that reason, I've been invited to kind of give you a little sample of that course and what we do on that course, which is mainly we use critical analysis to try and understand how we might be implicated in these systems of oppression. So we're going to have a bit of an active workshop session here over the next 25 minutes, and you're going to be doing exercises. So you'll need a pen and paper, and you'll be writing stuff in the chat. So before I kind of get into that, I've been asked to speak about what it means to be white and what we can do with our whiteness. So let's get going with that. For me, being white means these types of things. It means being seen as neutral or normal, for example, in media portrayals. It means not facing barriers in my daily life and interactions with authority figures or bureaucracy. It means being given space, being listened to, and being taken seriously, irrespective of the merit of what I happen to be saying at that moment. But it also means something I call impunity, which is this idea that I can say almost anything I want without consequences. So to kind of tell you what I mean by that, if you think about our current prime minister or the current president of the United States, think about their kind of brand and how they show themselves publicly. They perform whiteness specifically as this form of impunity, which is basically they can spout misinformation, they can lie, they can insult entire groups of people, they can do anything they like. Basically, they can fail to do the job that they're supposed to be doing, and yet they never face any kind of accountability or punishment for that. And that is impunity. So to the extent that we embody whiteness, white people, we benefit from these types of benefits, the ability to have impunity. Now, this is important when we start to talk about what can we do with whiteness. So I want you to pay attention to that, and we'll come back to it. But not just thinking about what someone like myself, a white man, how someone like myself might experience whiteness. We need to think a little bit about the structures that enable whiteness and where it comes from. So as has been mentioned in the previous sessions, whiteness is intricately limited to capitalism. And so white supremacy, the system we live under, actually upholds particular social structures that are required by capitalism. This is a quote on that for you by Cornel West, who's an American public intellectual. And he says this: all conceptions of race in the modern world are grounded in predatory capitalism, so that the talk about whiteness and blackness becomes a way of rationalizing social structures like slavery and Jim Crow. And it has to do with trying to extract labor and resources. It's an attack on their humanity and identity, but it's tied to economic structure. So when we talk about race in the modern era, we need to understand that it's part of a system of capitalism that's inherently exploitative. So I just want to list some of the ways that we as white people benefit from the social structures of white supremacy. Things like this. This is a myth called meritocracy, which is the idea that the UK is a level playing field and everyone has a fair chance at getting on. And so this myth is very, very widely held, particularly among white people. And basically it's to say, if you have a job, for example, that's a professional job or that is well paid, the myth is that you got that job or you got that position through hard work and inherent merit. And I think a lot of white people know that this is not true. We kind of understand it's not true at some level because we've kind of been lied to through our education, etc., about getting positions because we're good and because we have merit. But we hold on to it very tightly, I think, because a lot of our identity as white people is kind of tied up with concepts of being good at what we do. We benefit from an education system that's institutionally racist. This is just a fact if you look at the stats. So for example, if you look at the stats for degree classifications, just as one example, who gets first class, second class honors? It's a racist system. There are, as has been mentioned before, there's employment barriers to entry. So for example, if you want a professional job, you need professional qualifications. But to get those qualifications, you need to get entry into particular educational institutions. And that's much easier for white people because on average, we're much more likely to benefit from the social networks that allow us to get the right introductions, get the right internships, and of course, benefit from nepotism. We benefit from a housing system that is institutionally racist. Just for example, the numbers of people who own their own home among white people versus black people is very, very stark. But this includes inherited wealth. So as a white person, I'm much more likely to benefit from inherited wealth, which means I'm much more likely to be able to start on the housing ladder. But this also affects health because health outcomes for people are linked to housing. So people who are in poor housing are likely to have poor health, both because of things like pollution in areas where poor people live, but also because if you look at like how the NHS is funded, the cuts under austerity will affect marginalized people more than white people. And then there's a criminal punishment system, which is also institutionally racist. So as just one example, if you look at the numbers on stop and search that the police publish, you can see how that program is institutionally racist. So as a white person, you know, you're likely to benefit from a lot of these different systemic and structural factors that kind of make your life easier. So when we talk about this, there is one thing to pay attention to, though, which we haven't had talked about that much so far today, although I suspect it will come up in the next session, which is that it's possible sometimes to confuse white privilege with class privilege, and in fact they intersect. So if you basically, white people benefit from whiteness in proportion to their position in a complex hierarchy of race and class and gender. And so if you look up white privilege online, you will find definitions, a bit like I just gave you, a list of privileges that white people benefit from, for example, housing. However, that does interact with class as well. So although white people on average are much more likely to have good housing, there are some white people who don't have access to good housing, and those are working class and poor white people. Okay, so we need to be able to have a slightly more complex analysis than looking at whiteness on its own without understanding class and gender at the same time. So many professional spaces are still predominantly white, and in those spaces, discussion of race and class is still taboo. But when it is discussed, and I super congratulate Shelter for having this conversation today, that is amazing. What tends to happen is we can often focus on white guilt and what I call HR-friendly performances of contrition. This is things like checking our privilege, which is where someone like me would say, well, I recognize that I'm white and I benefit from white privilege and that is bad. And if that's as far as it goes, we're not really in any way committing to changing the structures that we're complicit in continuing systemic racism. So this could be things like advocating for workplace diversity without engaging with the structural barriers that reproduce exclusion. Or it could be issuing press releases that claim solidarity with Black Lives Matter, for example, without concrete commitments to changing the material conditions that maintain institutional racism. So I want to talk about one of these performances of contrition that is in the ascendant right now, which is unconscious bias. Okay, it's super popular right now, particularly among managers and among white people. This individualizes racism, which pushes power relations and economic exploitation into the background. It's based on flawed science, and it's demonstrated to have little to no impact on individual behavior, let alone the social structures that actually perpetuate racism. But it's popular among managers and liberal politicians as a way to change the subject away from institutional racism and the demands of movements like Black Lives Matter. So I'm going to sort of show you how this works through the example of Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, who recently had a bit of an interplay with unconscious bias training. And this is a play in 3 acts, so follow along. It starts on Twitter, where he took a photo with his deputy in his massive office in Westminster, taking the knee in apparent solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And you might think, well, this is great, like this is something that Boris Johnson would never do. He appears to be, showing solidarity with the movement. And that was on the 9th of June. But then on the 29th of June, he was interviewed on BBC Breakfast, and he was asked about whether he supported the core demand of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is to defund the police. And for those who don't know what that means taking resources and money away from policing and applying it instead to social services and community services that communities of color need. And when asked about whether he supported the underlying demands of Black Lives Matter, he said that defunding the police was, quote, nonsense. He said, it's a shame that the sentiment behind BLM was getting, quote, tangled up in these organizational issues. He also called it a moment, not a movement. So here we see how someone in a position of power who would like to be associated from a PR perspective with racial justice actually has no intention of engaging with the core demand of that movement. But forgetting about the pros and cons of that behavior, I want you to pay attention to what happened next. Because of this interview, he got pushed back, as you might expect. And his response a week later was this. In another radio interview, he said he would sign up for unconscious bias training. This is what he said. I think everybody should have unconscious bias training. I think it is important. There is always the risk of unconscious bias, and just saying, oh, well, it probably applies to other people, not me, is not the right thing to do. So let's just pay attention to what unconscious bias training allows him to do here. He is using a tone there to imply that he's a grown-up and he's a big boy and he's an adult. But what the adult thing to do here, at the very least, would be at least to show some accountability for his decision to claim solidarity with a movement and then disrespectfully dismiss the core demand of that movement. But he doesn't have to do that. Under unconscious bias, all he has to do is say, we will do this training. And also just note that the idea, I'm sure that Keir Starmer has unconscious biases, as I'm sure I do and everyone does. However, it wasn't unconscious, his decision to cynically try and get PR benefit from a movement, and it wasn't unconscious that he decided to very disrespectfully dismiss the core demand. So the problem with unconscious bias is that it allows people in positions of power like managers, HR directors, Liberal politicians to claim some kind of solidarity without engaging with the underlying demands of the movements. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, the question I would ask you all, particularly the white people, particularly people saying in the chat, what do we do with our white privilege, is this. How can those of us with privilege challenge the use of denialism like unconscious bias in our organizations? And I want to just take you back to where we started and talking about that characteristic that I told you that Boris and Donald Trump have, which is impunity. Those of us who benefit from the performance of whiteness can use that impunity to make it more difficult to, for these type of concepts to stand, okay? And we're going to talk about how to do that by having a bit of an exercise now in critical analysis. So for this, you will need a pen and paper, or if you're a digital person, you're very welcome to use a computer to do this. We do this exercise in groups on the course, but it's fine to do it on your own. And I would super encourage you to post some of your responses to the questions in the chat box so that we get a bit of a conversation going. Okay, so this is now a kind of exercise in critical thinking. Which is based on this. For those of you who are on LinkedIn, you may have even seen this. This came in my LinkedIn feed. It's a piece of content that a friend of mine, a colleague of mine shared. And as you can see at the bottom there, at the time I took the screenshot, it had been shared 14,000 times. So imagine that you're on LinkedIn and you see this in front of you. And the exercise is this. Why do you think that this post has been liked over 14,000 times? Number one. And number two, would you press like? Okay, so it's just two questions. Why do you think it's been shared 14,000 times? And would you press the little like button at the bottom? So if you can just write that down, and if you're willing to put it in the chat, that'll be fab, so we can have some kind of conversation about it. So I'll let you get on with that. Okay, so hopefully those of you who are on the chat can see the majority of people I can see responding have been saying yes, they would share. There are also some contrary opinions there, so it was worth having a look through the answers of what people are saying. I will just read one response here. People think it reflects empowered feminism. I think that's a good example of why people might share that. So what we're going to do now is, this is an exercise. This is imagining that this is happening to you. So imagine that whatever you said in response to my question, you actually did press the like button on this piece of content. Okay, and then what happens is, because you press the like button, your friend sees it in their LinkedIn feed. And when they see it, they send you this message as a direct message, okay? So this is what they say. Hey, why did you share that LinkedIn take? Full of neocolonial tropes. Talk about the good immigrant. The establishment only cares about patriarchy when it's Muslims they can hate on. Neoliberals sure love the Queen, and white feminism has its perfect mascot in Malala. Okay, so now you have another exercise to do here, which is using your own knowledge and Google. Please do use Google unless you understand every single statement being made here. Try and find out why your friend doesn't like this, because you are about to have coffee with your friend and you care about their opinion and you want to understand what they don't like about this. So just look at what's written there, get Google out and see as much as you can about what your friend is concerned about. And please do post what you find on the chat group so people can see. So several people said they didn't realize it was the Queen in that photo. So what I want you to do, if you're willing, is to just open up Google and look up any of these terms. So for example, good immigrant, if you don't know what that's referring to, what neocolonial means, what this point about patriarchy is, what white feminism is, and if you can just post in the chat anything you find. So someone has posted a definition of white feminism, which I'll just read out. I'm not sure where it's from. White feminism is a term used to describe and criticize feminist theories focusing solely on the experience of white women, failing to acknowledge and integrate the notion of intersectionality in the struggle for equality. So I'd ask you then to look at why your friend doesn't like this and what they think it's got to do with white feminism. Okay, so in terms of the point of this exercise, it's really good if you can do it as a conversation with other people, but the point of it is, it seems nice, it seems to align with concepts of feminism and stuff. At the same time, the choice of this particular way of framing sort of implies that Malala has been saved from a patriarchal culture. So basically, the point of this exercise is to look at what is allowed to be passed within white culture and particularly within kind of workplace culture as good, and how there are these Islamophobic tropes and there are these kind of good immigrant tropes. The good immigrant is the idea that you are welcome in this country as long as you are assimilate into the culture of this country. And so she's regarded as having done that, and this quote which is a particular slant on what her father said, makes it seem as if she has overcome the patriarchy of her culture via coming here. So that's kind of one way or one take that your friend might have had. Just to continue this exercise, imagine that you do go to the cafe, and obviously this is before COVID or after COVID, and you're sitting down with your friend and they've clicked through here. So if you look at the top here, it says the female lead. That's the organization that shared this content, and you click through there. And this, again, this is real. This is off the LinkedIn profile of that content as I saw it in my feed. This is the banner that you get when you click on The Female Lead. That's the organization that shared that little meme. And I'll read you what it says. The Female Lead is an educational charity dedicated to showing how women shape the world, founded by Edwina Dunn OBE. Okay, so I want you to look at that banner. This is a real piece of content. This is the organization who shared that thing. And I want you to answer these questions. And similarly, if you can write down your answer to this in the chat, that'll be fab. Can you identify anything in this banner that people might object to? Secondly, what is the Female Lead? Can you Google them? And 3, who is Edwina Dunn OBE and how did she earn her fortune? So I can see on the chat, which I believe is slightly lagged, that she is white. So you would not really have expected a white person, an organization run by a white person, to have that banner. So if anyone can sort of speak to how white people might have issues with the way that that banner is using those images, because those images are not Edwina Dunn OBE, and I guess that's not clear. Okay, so someone's found the answer. Edwina Dunn was one of the co-founders of Clubcard. If you've heard of dunnhumby, it's a company that was co-founded by Edwina Dunn and her husband, and they created Clubcard, which is, for anyone who doesn't know what Clubcard is, it's basically a surveillance system that was one of the first loyalty cards in supermarkets to track everything people buy so that they can basically make more money out of people by profiling them. Yeah, someone said made her a fortune in consumer insights. She is actually very rich. She is white. Someone's written, one would presume the person on the left was Edwina Dunn. Sadly not. So I will basically look into this and think about like why someone in that position in her charity, the Female Lead, would be sharing this content. So I'll just give you some of the answers. This is Edwina Dunn. She was the co-founder of Clubcard, and the Female Lead is her charity that she set up to help women and girls. So this is a little quote from what she said. Edwina knows firsthand what it feels like to work in a male-dominated industry and how women's lack of confidence so often holds them back. So I'm not trying to tell you that this is a bad charity and they don't do good work. What I'm trying to surface is how they use particularly images of women of color and a kind of very white feminism. The story of white feminism is that although she is very rich, and so by the way, she's got a net worth of $140 million, although she's very rich, although she's benefited from capitalism and from the surveillance of people, she would like to position herself as a feminist from the perspective of a rich white woman. And so the problem with this type of charity work is that you will see that they have these memes on LinkedIn, for example, that sort of attempt to position basically capital or people from the ruling classes, as she has joined through becoming rich in this way, as kind of saviors and interested in saving women and girls. And there's this neo-colonial aspect to it of saying that people, for example, from Muslim countries need saving. Okay, so that's the kind of thing we kind of cover on the course. The reason that I kind of raised that issue in terms of being asked to come today is I think, can we deconstruct the way white feminism is used in professional spaces to obscure corporate and government agendas? Okay, because that meme was very much in keeping with the foreign policy of this country, which is, you know, clearly neo-colonial and has Islamophobia as a kind of core tenet of it. And why is this kind of thing so rarely challenged in white spaces? So just to take away those who are asking, what can we do with our whiteness? Would you share that? And if you wouldn't share that, would you challenge that? And I just ask you to think about, if you're white, particularly if you're middle class, particularly if you're professional, you will get listened to. And if it takes an awful lot of white silence, basically, to allow this type of thing to kind of go and stand. And there is something that can be done by people who are white if you are willing to really push back against this. As I said before, you have impunity. You can basically say anything you like to an extent. So that's the end of that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of today. And I'm really looking forward to the next session about colonialism. Thank you.